I'm going to talk about licensing, and normally when I go to a group and I say that, about 4 or 5 people kind of sneak out the back, the reason they sit in the back of the pews at church, as you were talking about earlier. But I'll try to make this very interesting and relevant to you. We opened up talking about how, the pastor was saying, about civility in the national discourse, and our country is having a lot of issues with that right now. I cover a few topics, licensing being one of them on the policy side, which I find very interesting because you can get a lot of people on both sides of the political spectrum to unite around it. So I've, on my 2 main areas, at least over the last couple of years, which have been licensing and civil forfeiture, we have the ACLU signed on as a main group on both of those fronts. Not always on the same side on a lot of political issues, but really just have been great allies in this. And I found a really good response in front of audiences that are on both sides of the spectrum. And so I find this issue interesting. I think it's one that you can talk about with your friends and neighbors, and it's one that really, really affects our state in ways beyond a lot of other issues that we, I think, talk about. All right, so I call this our Guild-Ridden licensing system. So the reason I say that is if you go back hundreds of years, the guilds that came up a lot of times in England. So these were entities that at the time operated the way a lot of labor unions operate today, which was if you were a merchant and you came into a town and you wanted to work in some field, the guilds would prevent you from working unless you joined their guild and paid them money. And we actually have a lot of research. There were actually records kept back then, and we know that this, until the guilds were broken, and a lot of times broken, eventually, there was enough power, and you had governments that arose and said, you can't do that. We're going to allow more of a free market. People are going to be able to come in, do their craft, and we're going to let competition win out. That was really when you began seeing a lot of progress being made, and the competitive free market environment that we had for a long, long time. So the problem that's been here, so first of all, I'll go over what is licensing. All right, so licensing is government mandated fees, hours, trainings, and exams in order to hold a job. So in a lot of occupations, you want to work, you go ahead and work. In licensed occupations, the government says if you want to work in these certain occupations, you need what we would say permission from the government to work. We're going to assume that you're a danger to society, and we will not let you work unless you get this specific approval. All right, so why is this a big issue? So in Michigan, less than 1% of workers earn the minimum wage. About 15% belong to labor unions, but 21% of working residents have to have a license in order to work. Yet think of how much time and how much you have in the media talking about labor unions and talking about minimum wage. Nationwide, it's about 1% of the workforce makes minimum wage, but think of all the headlines you have and this fight for 15 and all these types of things. Okay, we have opinions on that issue, but licensing is a much bigger part. Even combining those two, licensing is a bigger part of our labor market. So it's a larger effect on residents than any other part of labor economics. Why do we have licensing laws? Probably a few of you can think of the reasons. The number one reason you always hear is health and safety concerns. So I have a study that's going through the peer review process right now. And so I went back and looked at, part of what that study does is looks at every single occupation that we license. And you can go back, and in a lot of these you can find the notes on how these came to be. And it's almost always the same story. There's an industry, they want to come in, and so it's a confusing thing for legislators because the industry is the one that comes in and argues to become licensed and to raise the licensing requirements. So if you go back and you look at when barbers became licensed in the state of Michigan, they did it the same way they've done in other states progressively over the years. They come in, they say, this is a dangerous occupation. We need to protect public health and safety. Here's some fees you should charge. Here's what you should do. Essentially, here's how you should lock out our competition. You put us in charge of the test, put us in charge of administering what there should be. By the way, grandfather in the people that we have. That is how almost every occupation has become licensed across the country. But another way of looking at that, because everyone will always, a lot of people will come, well, what about this occupation? What about this occupation? I'll stipulate, there are some where we do have some research on perhaps you need a license and that there might actually be a legitimate health and safety. But that's not how it works in Michigan. Nobody comes in and does a careful analysis and tries to determine what are the right amount of classes we should mandate and that kind of thing. It's very arbitrary. So here we go. Which situation worries you more and makes you want to ensure a job is well done? So the brakes are out in your car, you need new ones, or maybe your engine shot a piston and you need your engine rebuilt. If the job isn't well done, well, you could be killed in a car accident, which is one of the highest ways that people are killed accidentally in this country, about 30,000 people. Or you'd have to pay thousands of dollars for a new motor if it's not rebuilt. Are you more worried about that, or are you more worried if the paint on your old pole barn is peeling or your gutter is mishanging and you want somebody to come in and repair it? All right, who picks the latter? Who's more worried about the barn or the, okay, nobody. Usually it's nobody. Sometimes you get a random person. But in that first situation, it's an auto mechanic. That requires no mandatory education. It's merely a $6 test, and you can be an auto mechanic in Michigan. B, to be painting or gutters, that requires 60 hours of education and about $900 in fees to the state if you want to be a painter and gutter. I am not arguing that we should raise the mandates on our auto mechanics. Competition takes care of a lot of this. If you're, I will say, you don't find, if you want to be an auto mechanic, I promise you it won't be a guy who went and took a $6 test. My uncle's an auto mechanic. That, if you work for somebody, they will make sure you know what you're doing because it will cost them in business. If you do a bad job, you have legal liability, you have all these problems. Competition takes care of making sure that they do a good job by and large. Everyone's going to have problems all across, but the licensing of that area will not cause you to have less problems. I can assure to that. And yet we have a lot for painters and gutterers because those people came in and argued for a licensing requirement. We've had a tremendous growth in licensing. So if you go back to 1950, or really 1960 here in Michigan, only about 5% of workers had to have a license in order to hold a job. Today it's 30% nationwide. So you've had this growth that's continued. So for a long time, if you go back to 1950, almost every state had licensed doctors, lawyers, dentists, opticians, eye doctors. And they're pretty uniformly licensed in the same way state to state. Today, you've got states requiring licenses for auctioneers, which Michigan did up until a couple years ago. That was one we got rid of. So literally, to get up and talk to a room, I think it's pretty easy to find out if an auctioneer is good or bad, right? I mean, that shouldn't be too hard. He's not endangering anyone. But we required a license to be an auctioneer. Court clerks, fishermen, floor sanders, painters, interior designers, child care workers, and tree trimmers. And these are all different across the state. Some states license them, some don't. The number of hours you have to do, it varies very widely. And more, the big problem from my standpoint is this is affecting lower income areas. So if you're licensing doctors and lawyers, they probably know how to navigate the system pretty well. They're fairly savvy or well educated, and frankly, they're going to make a lot of money. But increasingly, we're talking about low income areas. Landscape workers. So if you want to be a landscape worker in the city of Detroit, you need to go pay a license to the city. Hair braiders. Some states license coaches, even farm laborers, not in Michigan, but in some states to be a farm laborer. Log scalers, bartenders, and taxidermists need a license. These are ones in other states. Luckily, most of these we don't have here in Michigan. Welcome to Detroit, right? If you look at this at more of a city-specific type way, so Detroit, they went through a bankruptcy. They've required a bailout at the city level, at the school level. If you listen to the mayor in Detroit, he's been talking a lot, and I give him credit. He's done this more than past mayors, but he says, I want to be a place where you can come and you can grow. And a lot of our criticism at the Mackinac Center side has been that for too long in the city of Detroit, business friendly means corporate welfare. It means stadium deals. It means we're going to give lots of tax subsidies to these big players, and you get all these press releases and it's flashy, and the city population just continues to go down, and the city income just continues to go down, and you have all these problems. Well, the new mayor's come in. He says he wants families to grow. He wants individuals to come in. I'd suggest that one place to start would be looking at licenses. So Detroit's motto, in the English, we hope for better things, it will rise from the ashes. Well, Detroit is trying to rise from the ashes. One way to do that would be, besides just calling for less restrictions, let's take a good look at these things. Detroit licenses 60 areas. About half of these are licensed by the state already, and Detroit just tacks on its own requirements on top of that. The other half are totally new areas. This includes window washers, landscapers, animal hide haulers, furniture movers. Those are areas that the state does not license, so you can go. I don't know what animal hide hauling is, but probably a big deal back in the in the 60s or 70s. But if you want to be a mover, move boxes, hire some college students, do moving for your company. If you want to do that right outside the city limits of Detroit, you're free to do so. You move in the city of Detroit, they're going to tack on extra fees and mandates. And also, welcome to Michigan. We want to come back. We're the comeback state, right? All right, but we license about 160 occupations. That's more than 20% of the workforce. So we've licensed bail bondsmen, butter graders, couriers, funeral directors, landscape architects, manicurists, mail callers, nursery growers. Those are just some of the more obscure ones, and then all the normal ones that we normally would talk about, especially in health occupations. So why does this happen? I talked a little bit about this in terms of people coming in and arguing for higher licensing. These fancy guys at the Mackinac Center, not me, guys like Mike Lefebvre, who does fiscal policy, he's an economist. They call there's two main economic terms for this. One is called public choice theory, and one is called regulatory capture. Public choice theory is pretty simple. What that basically means is concentrated benefits, diffuse costs. The other way to think about that, and that politicians respond to incentives the way most other people do. So if you're a legislator in Traverse City and the cosmetologists come in and say, hey, we really think that our work has become increasingly dangerous, you need to require more hours for people to come in. Well, if you go out and you get your hair done by a cosmetologist, you might pay a little bit more every year, but most of the time you probably have no idea. You don't know what the hours are. You don't know what the right number of hours are to license these areas, and maybe it costs you a little bit more, but you're not really aware of it. So your your costs are diffuse. It's a couple dollars a year. You don't really, even if you actually agree with me on this, you're probably not going to go lobby hard to cut down on those cosmetology licenses, especially for me. It doesn't affect me. But if you're a cosmetologist, you get a very concentrated benefits. Raising those standards limits your competition. It means that you will get more income a lot of times because you have less competition. And especially for a school that's doing these cosmetology licenses, well, they've just guaranteed that people have to come in to take your classes. So you're going to make a lot more money. So you have a lot of reason to lobby your legislator in Lansing. And it makes it very difficult to get rid of these things and for legislators to say no. And then regulatory capture. This has been around since, was a theory by an economist named George Stigler. And what his way of saying is, we propose a general hypothesis: every industry or occupation that has enough political power to utilize the state will seek to control entry. So no matter what happens, and to give a pure example of this, if you look back to after our financial crisis, the Congress and the Obama administration sought to heavily regulate the big banks. But what did they do? So they did regulate the big banks, and now the new Congress is coming in saying, really, those regulations didn't harm the big banks. They guaranteed a lot of money. They gave a bailout to the big banks. But we've had very, very little growth in your local community banks. So they use these regulations to hammer a lot of the little guys, the smaller banks. And the reason for that is once the industry was subject to regulations, they then began regulating very hard to use those regulations against their competition. That inevitably happens all the time. Probably a lot of your friends on the left in Traverse City don't realize that, or they kind of realize that happens, but they don't really understand why or what it's able. And it's a lot of our side of things is people say the Mackinac Center, they must be pro-business. We are pro-free market. Businesses will use government against their competitors when they can, and that's one of the big things that we fight against. So if you look at one of the first studies on licensing back in the 1960s, this is a quote from that study. This is from the federal government looking at licensing standards across the states. Legislatures are being overrun by requests from private interests which beg for the licensing of their occupations. So that really began when it happened, and it's continued through this day. All right, so let's do some real world examples here in Michigan. Here are some things that have just happened just in the last couple years. So we've had, to his credit, Governor Snyder came in. He said, I really care about this licensing issue, and I'm worried it costs jobs, I'm worried it costs income. And he put together a really good panel of people, we were one of them, to come together and do a report, and that report was very good. It called for getting rid of a lot of licensing and to try to set up a process to roll some of these things back, allow more competition. So the legislature for the last 6 years has been trying to do that. But as you'd imagine, there's people in the way every single time. So nurse practitioners, that was a good one. Michigan does two things with, is there any nurses in the room or ex-nurses? Okay. So nurses in Michigan have high licensing standards if you look compared to other states, and we limit what they're actually allowed to do. We're one of like 7 states that prevent nurses from essentially doing any types of prescriptions, and also where we require them to do a pretty high amount of education, and yet we still limit what they're allowed to do. Well, that's a big problem up here, especially in northern Michigan. You have areas in the Upper Peninsula where it's 100 miles to find a doctor. So maybe it makes sense to have nurse practitioners, which are highly educated nurses, be able to have more of an ability to serve people and to give prescriptions. And frankly, we just have a ton of research on this. If you look at the states that allow nurses to do, like my sister's a nurse, in Pennsylvania, they're pretty freely with what their nurses are allowed to do and do prescriptions. There are we have very positive health benefits from this, because if somebody wants to go get a prescription and they have to go to a doctor and that's 100 miles away or it costs them a lot of money, they just don't get the prescription. So it's better for them to go and see somebody who is a health professional and be able to do that. So anyways, long story short, we tried to roll back some rules on we wanted to allow nurse practitioners to have more freedom to operate. And so we had a big fight a couple years ago. So here's Rose Ramirez. She's a physician. She's the president of the State Medical Society, so the president of the Doctors Association. Surprise, surprise, the doctors aren't too happy with this. Sorry if there's any doctors in the room, but they wanted to keep their essentially monopoly on prescription medication. And they were not arguing with evidence. They didn't present studies to show this. Ramirez said, nurse practitioners are wonderful, but I think they need supervision and oversight. The best healthcare teams are physician-led. I worry about the safety of the patients in our state who deserve to have well-trained physicians supervising their care. But I would say if they deserve, if I were talking to Dr. Ramirez, I would say, well, why don't we make doctors go through 20 years of college? Wouldn't that make them even safer? We should up it to 20 years. Of course, she would deny that, and she'd have some reason. So the point that I would make is, at some point, the trade-off is just not worth it. You are getting people in, they can understand, and nurse practitioners have plenty of ability to give out prescriptions and do some other things. Same story, so contractors. So in Michigan, contractors is my favorite. My dad's a contractor. I worked for him for a while. And so they wanted to roll back some rules on some lower end contractors, and I don't want to give too many of those away because that's going to come up in the next slide. So they wanted to roll back a few of those rules, really minor things. The head of the group, administering the building and trades education. So these are the guys who, if you're a contractor in the state, you have to go to them to take the test, and they get money by you doing that. Said, state approval for maintenance and alteration contractors helps them be protected by the laws. So yes, protection, that's what he's worried about, the consumer protection. Landscape architects, sorry, that's a little off the page. So this was a huge fight. They wanted to roll back on landscape architects. The trade group said, without licensure, we simply cannot compete. Well, that might be true, but if that's the case, then your license isn't really worth all that much. All right. So we license things in a very arbitrary manner. So let's see if you can, we have a little quiz. I'm sorry, a lot of you, looks like you've been out of school for a while, but you thought you were done with those quizzes, but you're gonna be back, and I think we'll have fun with it. All right, So which of these requires a license? I'm going to do this by a show of hands. We'll do one by one. So you can look over that for a couple of seconds, and then we'll do them. All right, so show of hands. If you...
When you're talking license, you're not talking like building permits, just a license by the...
Right, not local permitting. This is... the state requires you to have a certain educational level, take a certain amount of classes, and pay the state and re-up that license. So not local permitting, just state license. All right, who thinks you need one to build a fence? A couple of people. How about do some house siding? All right, 4 or 5. Roofing? Roofing shingles? Oh, there's more. How about to do a asphalt driveway? About half, a little more than half. How about concrete driveway? About the same. Insulation? All right, yeah. Drywall, hanging drywall, most people. Painting, we talked about that one, so that one you should all get. Yes, painters need that. And hanging awnings on a house or a business. 2 or 3 people. All right. Oh, that one skipped ahead. All right, so here we go. Requires a license. This is a little hard to see. So carpentry, concrete. So if you got concrete, yep. Excavation, insulation, masonry, tile and marble, laying wood floors, siding, roofing, and house wrecking. But you do not need a license for drywall, asphalt, sewer and septic work, plaster, paving, carpeting, vinyl flooring, building a fence, awnings, or house moving. So some of you did okay, but the point of that is these are very arbitrary. Some of them you need, some of them that you don't. Nobody really actually knows, and it should show you. Yes?
I don't think so arbitrary. The ones that require a license are permanent. The ones that don't require a license are not permanent. They don't consider asphalt permanent, but they do consider concrete permanent.
I hope the drywall is fairly permanent, right?
No. If it gets wet, you can remove it.
Oh yeah, but you're painting, you can paint over. I would say, yeah, some of these you can see the logic of them doing it, but I don't know. I mean, putting siding up, that's probably about as permanent as maybe doing a fence. You can always go over it. Awnings versus roofing.
Sewer and septic, that's kind of surprising. Yeah. Considering. Yeah. That's surprising to me.
All right. So these are just the ones that are kind of the lower level. All right. So, and then the standards we have are very arbitrary across the country. So EMTs do 30 hours of training. This is for Michigan. Athletic trainers, you need over 1,400 hours of classes and 25 hours a year of continuing education. So the continuing education for an athletic trainer is about the same to do your total licensing standards as an EMT in Michigan. Up until 2013, commercial airline pilots needed 250 hours of flight time. Michigan cosmetologists and funeral directors need 1,500 hours of education and training. Across the nation, cosmetologists need 490 days of experience on average, 3 exams and a minimum grade level and age. In South Dakota, but in only 233 days of education, so about less than half the days, with no minimum wage or grade level in the state of Massachusetts. And I would like to see evidence if these higher days of education and number of exams helps. I don't know, has anyone been to South Dakota? Is the hair of the women better in that state compared to Massachusetts? I don't know. But I certainly haven't seen any evidence of health and safety differences.
I want to know if funeral directors are better here than others.
Right. Barbers need more than 3 years of training and 4 exams in Nevada, but they only need 6 months in the state of Wyoming. All right, so what's the economic research? This must just be the free market Mackinac Center. Those guys are crazy. Actually, from the Obama administration through the Koch brothers, the research on this is almost unanimous. In fact, we have we have tons and tons of studies on this. So the main guy on this is a guy named Morris Kleiner, who's at the University of Minnesota. And I asked him, are there any studies that show that licensing protects health and safety? And he knew of one. There was only one single study, and that was looking at midwife licensing in the 1900s to 1940s. So it's really, and even then it was a very small difference. So, you know, we have a lot of studies on these things, and they just aren't showing the actual health and safety protection. So an overall look shows that it generally causes economic harm, little help in public health and safety. So Kleiner says licensing has an important influence on wages, benefits, employment, and prices in ways that impose net costs on society, so net costs on consumers with little improvement for their health and safety. White House Council of Economic Advisors, sorry, this is off the screen, but they say the same thing. The evidence on this is little help for health and safety, but lots of higher costs for consumers. That was a White House report that was released last year. And I just use that to show, like, this is very across the spectrum, bipartisan. Studies from the Heritage Foundation, Mercatus Center, who are groups kind of on the right, and then also college professors that are very much on the left. So what's the cost here in Michigan? Nationwide, about 38 million workers. It's an average income of $41,000, and it costs about 2.8 million jobs and $203 billion every year in higher prices for consumers. Michigan, these licensing laws, they increase the average wage about 30% for people who are licensed. So there is, in effect, it does actually increase the wage of the individual licensee, but that's because it limits competition. We are paying that extra price for it. That costs about 125,000 jobs, $10.4 billion. And so it ends up costing about $1,000 per family.